Thank you to the organizers for the invitation and for all of you for attending. It is an honor to be introduced to this society. What I will be talking about is primarily chemical transformations. And so where light comes into play here really is about how we interrogate those reactions such that we can create better solar to fuel devices. So solar to fuels, I should also say I am currently moving to University of Colorado Boulder, though most of the work here was from Berkeley and LBNL. So solar to fuel, which encompasses both natural and artificial photosynthesis, is really about storing light energy into a chemical fuel. Now that process inherently has to go through charge. In other words, you have to separate the light into charge, and then mostly at a material surface that reconfigures chemical bonds into an evolving fuel. Okay. So it's nice to be able to use light because then we have a renewable source of energy in the form of sunlight. And also, if we can initiate these reactions with light, we can control that charge flow to the surface and therefore maybe control and definitely interrogate these important chemical transformations. Now, for photosynthetic processes, some of the targeted fuels and reactions are the following. There's water splitting, where the fuel that's evolving is a hydrogen gas. If you combine that with CO2 reduction, what you can get are alcohols such as methanol, so you get a liquid fuel. And there's also higher octane fuels that you can get as well. And all of these processes are essentially electrochemical transformations, so initiated by charge. And at a high level, that energy diagram looks like this, where on a material surface, at the initial state, you have the energy of the charge and the reactant molecule, and then some of that energy is stored into the chemical bonds of the product. Now, this reaction is dictated in the speed of the reaction by an activation barrier. And in order to get it to go at an appreciable speed, you need a catalyst, which essentially lowers that barrier and puts an intermediate state at the center of the solid-liquid interface. So that intermediate state is surface localized, and it sits between the bulk environment of the solid, which is the catalyst, and the liquid environment, which contains the reactant molecules. Okay. Those intermediate states essentially determine the two performance parameters of this chemistry of storing it into the fuel, which are the speed of the product evolution from the surface, so the product per area per second that's evolving. So the higher that speed, the more fuel you can accumulate in a given time. But also that speed is important because it directs the charge to the product that you want and not to a side reaction or degrading the material. Okay? The other important parameter is the overall long-term stability of the material during catalysis, so you can use the same material surface over and over again to produce that fuel. Okay? So for one of the reactions above, half of the water splitting reaction is the water oxidation reaction, which is shown up here. That requires 4 charges, 2 water molecules to create the product of oxygen and 4 protons. Now the solid state catalysts that tend to do this well are transition metal oxides and metal oxides. So it can be a full material or it can be a nanocluster like this, and this is the one that all plants have to do the water splitting process. Okay. Now this conversion of charge into the product, there's many steps to do that because you're talking about 4 different charges that have to be transforming chemical bonds into this product flow. That's essentially very characteristic of all the chemical reactions I just showed you. Those different steps are thought to occur in a certain sequence, and I'm going to show them for the water split, for this water oxidation reaction on a transition metal oxide surface. So the first step is simply putting this metal oxide into water, equilibrating it with water, and already that can transform a water molecule into an adsorbed OH or hydroxyl group. This step doesn't require any input of energy. The next step does. That comes from charge that transforms this OH group into a highly active intermediate in the form of an atomic oxygen absorbed to the surface. Now we call these catalytic intermediates because they can essentially catalyze the first chemical bond of the water oxidation cycle, which is a singly bonded OO species. Okay? Afterwards, more charge transformations take place, and you create the double bond with the oxygen and release it from the surface. Okay? Now, it is thought that one step is the slowest step, which is this getting to this first chemical bond, and that controls the product evolution rate. So materials are essentially differentiated by this, where the stability of that catalytic intermediate guides the product evolution rate. So if it's too stable, the product evolution rate is too low, and if it's not stable enough, it's also low. Okay. Now, the problem with this paradigm is that essentially it's mainly theoretically understood, and the main experimental parameter that is measured is only the product evolution rate by the steady state current going from the surface. Okay. Little is known about experimentally how these steps take place and what determines each of the critical steps, what in the environment is creating them. So in order to do this, so basically the goal of my research and the goal of, I believe, a lot of other research right now is to really truly deconstruct this full reaction pathway at a solid-liquid interface. So from the point of charge transfer, and here we're talking about a semiconductor for the charge comes from a valence band hole, how quickly it traps to create a catalytic intermediate from which the chemical bond forms and then product is released. Now this reaction path, so the idea is to time resolve this full reaction pathway. That pathway is tuned by essentially how the electric field drops across this interface, as well as all the dynamics of the reactant molecules. Essentially, this charge is going to interact with the vibrations and rotations of these molecules such that you can rip them apart and create these intermediates at the surface. Okay? So in order to time resolve this pathway, we need to have an ultra-fast injection of charge to the surface, and we get them from a light pulse. This is essentially ultra-fast light pulse that can create electron-hole pairs at the N-type semiconductor liquid interface. That built-in electric field separates that light into charge. The charge then initiates the water oxidation reaction. So this has been shown before for continuous lasers. We showed it with a 150 femtosecond laser pulse that we can get nice product evolution with a high quantum efficiency, which means that 75% of that light is separated into charge, and also fully Faradaic oxygen evolution. So all the charge is going to your product. So we're set up essentially to time resolve the pathway from that point of charge transfer. And we do that by putting it in an optical setup that's shown here, where we excite that sample, that light beam, and then we interrogate it with a probe pulse that's in reflectance. We use full electrochemical cells such that the full chemistry is taking place, and we can time resolve the reaction between the two excitation pulses. Now, it's really hard to detect these intermediates because they sit at that sliver of the interface between in the center of a very bulk environment. And furthermore, that bulk environment is abruptly changing. You're going from a solid to a liquid. So you have to have a strategy to understand how you're going to see these intermediates. And one of the things that we use is that we use a large range of the electromagnetic spectrum to target the same intermediate from different perspectives. So that intermediate, the surface, can have vibrations. So that's using infrared. Or we can look at it as trapped charge, which you use the optical or UV visible spectrum. In the future, one would want to go to X-rays such that you can get the very local electronic orbital of the intermediate. And secondly, the strategy is that while many calculations have determined what kinds of intermediates can form, what we're doing now is using those calculations to predict how we could see those intermediates within this solid-liquid interface environment. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples on a model system, which is the water oxidation reaction on a single crystal strontium titanate sample. And the first is how we understand the vibrations of those intermediate species. So initially, we have a water-absorbed 100 single crystal strontium titanate. When we inject that hole to the surface, it can quickly localize to the terminating oxygen site of the titanium atom, creating what's called an oxyl radical. The way we know that is that this oxyl radical decouples the subsurface oxygen from the rest such that it creates a large IR activity perpendicular to the sample plane. And essentially, that vibration is very molecular, and you can think of it as attached to this oxyl radical for as long as it lives. That vibration experimentally is shown here. It only occurs with hole injection and a water-absorbed surface, and it only occurs with a certain polarization of the infrared light, or P polarization, which means it's a vibration that's vibrating perpendicular to the surface. So to get this true molecular picture really required an extensive collaboration with theory, and that was done with Das Pimaraju and David Prendergast at the Molecular Foundry of Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So what they did is calculate the oxygen motions for a water-absorbed strontium titanate slab, both in the ground state without hole injection and with hole injection that creates the Oxyl radical. And this is the IR absorption spectrum that they find. So both in the ground state and the Oxyl, this is a bulk phonon. This is an artifact of the unterminated or non-water absorbed surface. And this is weak IR activity associated with subsurface oxygens underneath either a hydroxyl or water absorbed group. Now the major thing that happens in the Oxyl configuration here at M1 is associated with that subsurface oxygen of the Oxyl radical. Okay? To show you that it's truly decoupled from the rest, I have movies at this frequency range in the ground state and Oxyl. So in the ground state, what you're observing is essentially a bulk breathing mode that's IR inactive. When you get to the Oxyl configuration, I want to point out this oxygen atom right here. It gains a large amplitude motion. Okay? So the reason the M1 here agrees with what we see experimentally, it's theoretically and experimentally, it's observed in the same conditions. It has the same polarization properties, and it's also very close in energy to the longitudinal optical phonon where we observe it in our spectra. Okay, so that's one way to see these intermediates, which is through their vibrations. We can also see them as trapped surface charge, which essentially creates mid-gap states in the semiconductor, shown here. These mid-gap states are really nice because they're separated from the delocalized charge in the valence band so that we can understand essentially the time scale with which the surface charge is created from these valence band holes. Okay? And that's through their optical transitions of these mid-gap states to the conduction band edge. So if we monitor the creation of these during catalysis, we find how fast the surface charge gets there. And that's shown with this red curve here, and essentially a time constant of 1.3 picoseconds. That's essentially time resolving the formation of this mid-gap state. Now, to assign it to a particular intermediate, we need a structurally sensitive probe. And that's what you're seeing in blue here. This is essentially the population of the surface with Oxyl radicals through its vibrational signature. And as you can see, they meet up very nicely for this early 1.3 picosecond time constant. Now things deviate here because when you're probing the population of a surface through the vibration of the surface species, it's more complicated. You have to trap the charge, the vibration has to be induced, and that vibration can couple to nearby modes. And that's essentially what's happening in this time constant here. So you really need two perspectives of the same intermediate to define the time constant with which it forms and which kind of intermediate you're forming. Now, this then definitively assigns this 1.3 picoseconds to populating the surface with Oxyl radicals. On the strontium titanate surface, there's also another type of intermediate that's expected by theory, and that's that of the bridge radical, where the hole localizes in plane on an oxygen site between two titanium atoms. Now, this optical probe should be generally sensitive to these different kinds of intermediates since they're nearby in energy. And so it could, in principle, detect whether we are seeing bridge radicals. Now, to identify that, you need something, again, structurally sensitive. What we discovered is that these transitions to the conduction band edge are polarized. In other words, for the transitions of the bridge radical, it's a fully in-plane optical dipole, whereas for the Oxyl radical, it's out of plane. And when we measured our sample, we found that indeed we have a polarization dependence, and it's predominantly in plane, meaning that this 400 nanometer transition should relate to populating the surface with bridge radicals. That then essentially furthers the interpretation of this data, which essentially tells us that this time constant relates to populating the surface not only with Oxyl radicals, but also with bridge radicals. So using two different types of probes also tells us what can simultaneously form with another species. And that then goes to tell us essentially how these intermediates are formed and what stabilizes them at the surface. In other words, if this time constant relates to two very different radicals, geometrically different, in plane and out of plane, it means that it's not something surface specific or to a particular lattice site that's determining that time constant, but something that's common to both, which are these neighboring water molecules. Okay? Now, if you have neighboring water molecules involved, that invokes this idea in chemistry, which is about solvation. So if you have any charged species or partially charged species that can reorient the neighboring solvent molecules, or here water molecules, essentially changing the polarization environment and hugging that radical in place such that it's stabilized at the surface and doesn't go back to the valence band and lives long enough to produce a chemical bond. Now, the more usual way to describe the stability of these radicals is if a hole is trapped there, a proton leaves and creates a local lattice distortion. While certainly that'll happen, especially for creating the Oxyl radical, what we're observing by these time constants is essentially that many water molecules are also involved in stabilizing these intermediate species. That gives us a very nice picture of this initial step of the water oxidation reaction on strontium titanate. One is the local electronic structure of these catalytic intermediates, the bridge radical by that in-plane optical dipole, and the Oxyl radical by its vibration. We find that both are populating the surface, and that the time constant which populates them tells us about why they're stabilized there. So it has to do with the electrolyte or with these neighboring water molecules. Okay. Recently, other groups have also looked at these intermediate species on different material surfaces. I'm just going to summarize them quickly here. There's an iron oxo intermediate on the iron oxide surface, a cobalt oxo intermediate on the cobalt oxide surface, and then here's the strontium titanate result. So essentially, by being able to observe these critical catalytic intermediates, we're on the precipice of being able to deconstruct that catalytic cycle and the reaction pathway. Okay? And here are some future directions. Essentially, we would want to introduce other probes of this surface, X-rays to get at the local electronic orbitals quantum mechanically. The other thing we would want to do is time resolve, since we've identified these catalytic intermediates, identify when the first chemical bond happens and how that happens through what interactions with its local environment. Thirdly, now that we know something more about the details of this reaction mechanism, how do we use it for both materials design and designing the conditions of the electrolyte? So these are some examples of different materials that have been discovered recently that are the most active for water oxidation. So even while this has been studied for decades, there are ways you can tune materials to make them better. We're looking at these critical intermediates that should differentiate them. And since we see the involvement of water in stabilizing them, the electrolyte conditions are also important. And finally, we also want to use what we know for device design. So if we can truly time resolve a catalytic cycle, it means we don't have to initiate it with a steady state flow of charge. We can do it with a pulse charge at a time scale that's inherent to that catalytic cycle itself. And overall, I think that these goals are not that different from defining equations, for example, for an NP junction that is involved for Moore's law and scalability and so on. There, it's an equilibrium phenomenon. Here, so it's this kind of static, electrostatic phenomenon. Here we're talking about high energy conversion, a non-equilibrium phenomenon, so it inherently involves dynamics and molecular structure. But the idea is to get some of those principles around which we can design materials and devices. And finally, I'd like to thank my group. The optical work was done by Jihan, Stephanie, and Dan. The infrared work was done by Jihan, Matthias, and David. These are my funders, and the theory collaborators are David Prendergast and Daspa Marashu. Thank you very much for your attention.